The fluorescent lights in the courtroom buzzed with a dull hum, casting an artificial glow over the sterile wood-paneled walls. It smelled of old paper and sweat, the scent of tension, of lives dissected by the law. The jury sat in eerie silence, eyes flicking between the officers on the stand and the defendant at the table. Maya Carter sat rigid, her posture perfect despite the storm swelling inside her. She had always known how the world worked, how the color of her skin dictated how she was perceived before she even opened her mouth. But this was something else. Two white officers, Detective Brian O'Connell and Officer Luke Harris, sat comfortably on the stand, recounting their version of events with an ease that sent a slow, burning rage through Maya's veins. Lies, every word of it. They painted her as an aggressor, a threat, someone who had resisted them in the middle of a routine traffic stop. According to them, she had been belligerent, uncooperative, dangerous. They spoke with the confidence of men who believed their words carried more weight than any truth she could offer. Maya's lawyer, Daniel Green, sat beside her, his jaw tight, his fingers drumming against his legal pad. He knew they were lying. She knew they were lying. Hell, anyone with common sense could see it. But that was never enough in a place like this. The courtroom was quiet, except for the officers' voices, measured and steady, rehearsed like they had done this 100 times before. She refused to show identification, O'Connell continued, his gaze locked on the jury as if to make sure they were soaking in every syllable. Then, when we asked her to step out of the vehicle, she became aggressive. We had no choice but to restrain her. Lies. Maya clenched her fists beneath the table, nails pressing into her palms. She had complied. She had shown them her ID, spoken calmly, kept her hands where they could see them, but that didn't matter. It never did. The prosecutor, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a voice like rusted metal, nodded along as if every word was gospel. So, in your professional opinion, would you say Ms. Carter posed a threat to public safety? Officer Harris leaned forward. Absolutely. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Maya's stomach tightened. There it was, the label. Threat. A word that carried weight when attached to a black woman, a word that could justify anything. She felt the stares of the jury, saw the flicker of doubt in some eyes, blind trust in others. Some were already convinced. Others were watching, waiting. Maya inhaled slowly, forcing the anger down. Not yet. Not now. Daniel leaned toward her. His voice low. They're setting the stage. We need to stay calm. She gave a stiff nod, her pulse hammering. The judge, a heavy-set man with thinning gray hair, adjusted his glasses. Ms. Carter, do you have anything to say before we proceed? Maya exhaled through her nose and rose to her feet. Every movement, deliberate. The room stilled, her heart pounded, but she kept her expression cool, unreadable. She reached into her blazer pocket, feeling the weight of the small, laminated card between her fingers. Slowly, deliberately, she placed it on the table in front of her. The courtroom fell into dead silence as the bold letters on the badge glinted under the overhead lights. Central Intelligence Agency, clearance level, classified. Gasps echoed through the room. The prosecutor's face paled. The officers stiffened, eyes darting between each other in barely concealed panic. Maya tilted her head slightly, her voice quiet but razor-sharp. Now, let's talk about the truth. The air in the courtroom shifted. The game had changed, and they knew it. The silence in the courtroom stretched thick and suffocating, as if the very air had been sucked out of the room. The prosecutor's lips parted slightly, but no words came. The officers, men who had been so smug, so sure of their invincibility, sat frozen, their confidence unraveling at the edges. The weight of Maya's CIA clearance, both literal and symbolic, crushed down on the moment like a hammer waiting to fall. Maya didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. She didn't revel in their shock. She just stood there, composed, unreadable, just as she had been trained to do. But deep down, beneath the surface, her pulse was pounding like a war drum. She wasn't nervous. No, not nervous. She was furious, because this wasn't the first time. 5 years ago, Langley, Virginia, Maya sat in the training facility's dimly lit briefing room, the scent of burnt coffee lingering in the air. She had been the only black woman in her class, something she had learned to carry like armor. Across from her, her mentor, Special Agent David Marks, leaned back in his chair, his sharp blue eyes studying her. He was an older man, grizzled, a career intelligence officer who had seen the worst the world had to offer. "You know what they're saying about you, right?" he asked, his voice steady. Maya tilted her head slightly. "They say a lot of things," Mark smirked. "That you don't belong here. That you got through recruitment because they needed diversity hires. That the field isn't for people like you." Maya didn't flinch. She had heard it all before, in different ways, in different places, from professors in law school who had underestimated her, from cops who had pulled her over just to see the look of surprise when they realized she wasn't the easy target they expected. She had spent her entire life walking the tightrope of perception. Too strong and she was aggressive, too quiet and she was weak. It was a game she never asked to play, but one she had learned to master. She met Marks's gaze without hesitation. "Do you think I belong here?" Marks studied her for a long moment, then let out a short chuckle. "Hell yes, you do. And that's exactly why they're scared." Maya exhaled slowly, but the weight in her chest never quite disappeared. "They'll keep testing you," Marks continued, his tone turning serious. "Not just out there, but in rooms like this. In places where the rules should protect you but don't. You need to be 10 steps ahead, always." Maya nodded. She had been 10 steps ahead her entire life. Present day, the courtroom. The judge cleared his throat, snapping Maya back to the present. "Ms. Carter, I assume there is an explanation for this." His voice wavered slightly, as if suddenly unsure of how to proceed. Maya picked up her badge and tucked it neatly back into her blazer. "There is, Your Honor." She turned her gaze toward the officers, locking eyes with Detective O'Connell first. His face was a shade paler than before. "But first, I'd like to hear more about what I allegedly did that night." O'Connell shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Harris looked to the prosecutor as if silently begging for an intervention. The prosecutor, regaining some composure, straightened. "Ms. Carter, your employment status is irrelevant to the facts of this case." Maya arched an eyebrow. "Is it? Because from where I'm sitting, it seems highly relevant. These officers have painted me as a violent threat, as someone who refused to cooperate. But I'm not just some random woman they pulled over. I'm a federal intelligence officer. I know the law. I know my rights." A few members of the jury exchanged glances. Doubt was creeping in. "Good." The prosecutor hesitated, then shifted tactics. "Ms. Carter, are you suggesting these officers knowingly gave false testimony?" Maya let silence hang in the air before answering. "I'm suggesting they underestimated who they were lying about." Harris swallowed hard. The judge's gaze darkened. He turned to the officers. "Detective O'Connell, Officer Harris, do you wish to amend any part of your statement before we proceed?" O'Connell sat up straighter, regaining a hint of his earlier bravado. "No, Your Honor. Everything we've stated is the truth." Maya forced herself to remain calm, but inside her frustration burned white-hot. She could expose them easily, pull footage from street cameras, demand the release of their body cam footage, but she knew how this worked. The system protected itself. Even with her credentials, she would have to fight for every inch of justice. Daniel, her lawyer, leaned toward her again, voice barely above a whisper. "They're going to double down. She nodded, her mind already calculating her next move. Let them, the judge sighed, rubbing his temples. Very well, Miss Carter, you may proceed with your statement. Maya took a slow breath. The entire courtroom was waiting for her. But this wasn't just about her anymore. It never had been. It was about the next black woman who wouldn't have a badge to pull out. The ones who didn't have a lawyer like Daniel. The ones whose voices were drowned out by the system. She was 10 steps ahead, and she was about to make them regret underestimating her. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom. Unbeknownst to Maya, outside the courthouse, a black SUV idled at the curb. Inside, a man in a dark suit watched the courtroom feed through a tablet, his expression unreadable. "She's making this difficult," a voice crackled through his earpiece. The man didn't respond. He simply watched Maya on the screen. Her presence commanding, her voice unwavering. Then, for the first time, he allowed himself a small smile. She always does. The courtroom's air had shifted. Maya could feel it, thick like an oncoming storm, pressing in from all sides. The jury members, once passive observers, now leaned forward slightly, their attention hooked. The prosecutor's lips were tight, her confidence cracking. And the officers, O'Connell and Harris, weren't just nervous. They were angry. Maya had seen that look before. She had seen it in the eyes of instructors who hated that she outperformed them in training, in colleagues who had assumed she was a quota hire until she proved them wrong, in men who despised that she didn't shrink under their scrutiny. The judge rubbed his forehead. "Miss Carter, if you have relevant information to counter the officer's claims, now would be the time." Maya nodded once, keeping her expression measured, her voice calm. "Your Honor, these officers stated that I refused to provide my identification, that I resisted, that they were forced to restrain me. All of that is false." She turned to Daniel, who was already sliding a tablet across the table. "I'd like to submit evidence to contradict their testimony." The prosecutor's face barely concealed her irritation. "Your Honor, the defense is attempting to derail these proceedings." The judge raised a hand. "You'll have a chance to object after I review the material." Maya handed over the device, her movements slow and deliberate. The footage wasn't anything groundbreaking, just a simple recording from a nearby traffic camera. But it showed everything. The moment the officers approached her vehicle, how she calmly handed them her license, how their expressions shifted when they saw her name, how they pulled her from her car anyway. The judge's gaze hardened as he watched. The courtroom remained silent except for the faint hum of the playback. Harris's jaw clenched. O'Connell's fingers twitched slightly against the armrest. Maya didn't need to look at them to know what they were thinking. They thought they had picked the right kind of black woman to lie about. One without power, one without a voice. They were wrong. The judge exhaled sharply, setting the tablet down with deliberate force. "Detective O'Connell, Officer Harris." His voice carried a weight it hadn't before. "Would you like to revise your statement?" A pause. A charged silence. Then O'Connell leaned forward, his expression carefully neutral. "Your Honor, while we acknowledge that Ms. Carter did provide identification, we stand by our assessment that she posed a threat. Body language, refusal to exit the vehicle promptly, her overall demeanor, it was all consistent with someone who was escalating." Maya's stomach tightened. There it was. The shifting of goalposts, the way the narrative always changed. When facts didn't support the lie, the prosecutor straightened. "Your Honor, police officers are trained to assess situations in real time. If they felt the situation was dangerous, we cannot discount their judgment based on a single piece of footage that lacks audio context." Maya wanted to laugh. She had seen men like O'Connell and Harris worm their way out of accountability. Before, they weren't admitting anything, they were doubling down. Daniel's voice was low in her ear. "They're trying to reframe it. Make it about how they felt rather than what they did. Maya's fingers curled into her palm beneath. The table, they were still fighting this, still twisting the truth. For a split second, doubt crept in. Would it even matter? She thought of her mother then, the woman who had raised her on the foundation of quiet strength. She had been only 14, the first time she truly understood how the world saw her. Her mother had been pulled over on their way home from church, wearing her Sunday best, hands trembling on the wheel. The officer had spoken to her like she was nothing, treated her like she was dangerous, even as she apologized for existing in front of him. When he finally let them go, Maya had been furious. "Why didn't you fight back?" she had asked. Her mother had given her a tired smile. "Baby, I fought by making it home." That was the moment Maya had decided she would fight differently. She would make sure no one ever had to choose between dignity and survival. Maya inhaled, slow and steady, letting that memory root her. Then she turned to the judge, her voice steady. "Your Honor, the footage contradicts key elements of their testimony. But if perception is the standard they want to argue, I have additional evidence that speaks to theirs." She nodded toward Daniel. He slid another folder onto the table. The prosecutor hesitated. Because she knew. Everyone in the room knew. Maya had done her research. She wasn't just fighting back. She was dismantling their credibility piece by piece. Inside the folder were formal complaints, multiple ones. O'Connell and Harris had a history, excessive force, misconduct allegations, all swept under the rug. The prosecutor's mouth opened, then closed. The jury shifted, tension thick in the air. For the first time since the trial began, Maya saw something flicker in O'Connell's eyes. Fear. Not because he felt guilty, but because he realized he might actually face consequences. The judge sighed, rubbing his temples. "This is serious. I will need to review everything thoroughly." Maya nodded. "Of course, Your Honor." She wasn't done. Not yet. But as she sat back down, she could feel the officer's eyes burning into her, and she knew. This wasn't over. Not in here. Not out there. And then, just as the judge was about to adjourn for the day, Maya's phone vibrated inside her blazer pocket. Single message flashed across the screen. "You're making enemies, Carter. Watch your back." She stared at it for a long moment. Then, slowly, she looked up and across the courtroom, past the officers, past the jury. A man in the gallery, dressed in an expensive dark suit, was watching her. Expression unreadable, unmoving, but the hint of a smile touched the corner of his lips, like he knew something she didn't, like he was waiting. Maya's pulse quickened. This wasn't just about O'Connell and Harris anymore. Something bigger was at play, and she was right in the middle of it. The message still burned in Maya's mind as she sat in her parked car, staring at the screen. "You're making enemies, Carter. Watch your back." Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel. She knew this case would ruffle feathers, but this was different. A warning, or maybe a threat. She exhaled, willing herself to stay calm, to think. It wasn't just O'Connell and Harris anymore. The man in the dark suit, the one watching her from the courtroom, he wasn't just another spectator. He had been there for her. But why? Her gut twisted. The moment she left the courthouse, she had scanned the area, trying to spot him again. But he was gone. And now, this message. Maya's instincts were screaming. Something bigger was at play. She reached for her phone, fingers hovering over a contact she hadn't called in months. Marks, the man who had trained her. The only person who would give her answers without hesitation. But before she could press the button, headlights flared in her rearview mirror. A car. Black. Tinted windows. Maya's pulse spiked. Coincidence or something else? The car didn't move, just sat there, idling. She watched it through the mirror, her muscles coiled tight, then slowly it inched forward, pulling up alongside her. Maya didn't turn her head, didn't let them see her react. She just waited. The driver's window rolled down, revealing O'Connell. His smirk was slow, lazy, the kind of grin worn by men who believed they were untouchable. Harris sat in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead. "Hell of a show today, Carter," O'Connell said, voice dripping with condescension. Maya finally turned her head, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Not a show, detective," she said coolly, "just the truth." O'Connell chuckled, shaking his head. "You really think that badge means something?" Her fingers itched to wipe that smugness off his face. "And no, it does," she said. His smirk faltered. A flicker of something darker passed over his features. "You don't get it, do you?" he murmured, voice quieter now, just for her. "You don't win this. You never win this." Maya leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice to match his. "Then why are you so scared?" For a split second, something cold flashed in his eyes. Then, without another word, he rolled up his window. The car peeled away, disappearing into the night. Maya sat there, heart hammering against her ribs. This wasn't over. Not even close. She barely slept that night. Every noise outside her apartment felt louder than usual. Every shadow seemed to stretch just a little too long. By morning, exhaustion clung to her. But she pushed through it. She had bigger problems. By the time she stepped into the courthouse again, the air was different. Thicker. Something had shifted. Daniel met her at the door, expression tight. "We have a problem," he said, voice low. Maya frowned. "What now?" He pulled out his phone and showed her the screen. A news article. CIA agent under investigation for misconduct. Her stomach dropped. "What the hell is this?" Daniel exhaled sharply. "Fabricated but effective." Maya's blood boiled. This was O'Connell. This was their move. They couldn't discredit her in the courtroom, so they were doing it in the public eye. She clenched her jaw. "They think this will rattle me." Daniel studied her carefully. "Will it?" She looked away for a brief moment, steadying herself. Then she met his gaze again, fire burning behind her eyes. "No." The courtroom was more crowded than before. Reporters, people whispering. The article had done its job. Seeded doubt, stirred controversy. The prosecutor looked almost smug as she approached the bench. "Your Honor, given the recent allegations against Ms. Carter, I believe her credibility should be reassessed." Maya's jaw tightened. She expected this. The judge, however, wasn't so easily swayed. "I will not entertain baseless accusations unless you have actual evidence." The prosecutor's expression soured, but she nodded. Maya exhaled slowly. Small victory, but she wasn't foolish enough to think they were done. And sure enough, O'Connell took the stand next. The smirk was gone. Instead, he played the role of the weary officer. The victim. He spoke of fear for his safety, of heightened tensions in today's climate. He painted himself as the reasonable one, the responsible one, and Maya, the aggressor. The jury watched him carefully, absorbing every word. She could see it. Some of them were buying it. Her fingers dug into her palms beneath the table. Then, in the middle of his testimony, O'Connell did something unexpected, something dangerous. He looked directly at her and said, "She threatened me after the arrest." Maya's breath caught. Lies, blatant, desperate lies, but they had weight. The prosecutor leaned forward. "Could you elaborate, Detective?" O'Connell nodded solemnly. "She told me I'd regret pulling her over. That she had connections, that people like me wouldn't be safe anymore." The words were like gasoline to a fire. The jury shifted. The judge frowned. Maya's pulse pounded in her ears. She had never said that. Never. Daniel was already on his feet. "Objection!" The judge waved him down, then turned to Maya. "Ms. Carter, do you deny making that statement?" Maya stood slowly, inhaling deeply. She could feel every eye on her, waiting, watching. But she didn't falter. "Yes," she said firmly. I absolutely deny it. O'Connell tilted his head slightly, studying her. Then so quietly that only she could hear, he mouthed, "Prove it." And in that moment, Maya knew he had something planned, something she hadn't seen coming. Trick a setup. And before she could process it, the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. A man stepped inside, the same man from before, the one in the dark suit. He moved, slowly, deliberately, taking a seat in the back row. And for the first time since this all started, a sliver of doubt crept into Maya's chest, because suddenly, this case wasn't just about O'Connell and Harris anymore. Something bigger was unfolding, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for what came next. Maya's heartbeat thundered in her ears as the man in the dark suit took his seat. Everything inside her screamed that this was the moment, the shift, O'Connell's smugness, the jury's unease, the prosecutor's confidence. It all hinged on whatever was about to happen next. She forced herself to stay still, to breathe evenly. Control the room, control the outcome. That was the first thing they taught her at the farm, one of the many lessons drilled into her at Langley, and right now, O'Connell thought he was in control. He thought he had trapped her. She let him believe it. The judge turned to Maya. "Miss Carter, do you have anything to refute Detective O'Connell's claim?" Maya glanced at Daniel. He gave a barely perceptible nod. He had already retrieved something from his briefcase and placed it on the desk between them. Flash drive. O'Connell's jaw tightened. His gaze flickered to the drive for half a second. Just enough. Maya caught it. He knew what was on it, which meant it was exactly what she needed. She turned back to the judge. "Yes, Your Honor, I do." Daniel handed the drive to the bailiff, who took it to the clerk. A screen flickered on in the courtroom, a recording. The timestamp placed it at 2 days before her arrest. And then the audio played, O'Connell's voice, clear as day. "She's a problem. We need to make sure she understands where the line is." Maya's stomach clenched, but she didn't react. Another voice, Harris, hesitant. "Nervous. Are you sure? She's not just some nobody. If this gets out..." "It won't get out," O'Connell cut in. "We handle it the way we always do. She gets a charge, she gets a warning. And if she pushes too hard, a pause. Accidents happen." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, shocked murmurs. The jury looked stunned. The judge banged his gavel. "Order!" But Maya wasn't looking at the judge. She was looking at O'Connell. He had gone pale. For the first time, his mask cracked. The prosecutor shot to her feet. "Objection. This is entrapment." Maya turned, her voice ice-cold. "That's not entrapment. That's a confession." The judge held up a hand. "Where did this recording come from?" Maya exhaled slowly. Time for the hammer. She turned her gaze to the back of the room, to the man in the dark suit. He was watching her, waiting. She met his eyes. Then he nodded. Silent permission, Maya turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, the source of this evidence is classified." Gasps. O'Connell's hands clenched into fists. "Bullshit." Maya's lip curled. "You seem upset, Detective. You set me up." His voice was raw with fury. Maya tilted her head. "No. You set yourself up. I just made sure people were watching this time." The judge rubbed his temples. "Ms. Carter, you're going to have to clarify what you mean by classified." Maya exhaled. She had been careful up until now, but there was no point hiding anymore. She reached into her blazer and pulled out a single-paw black leather credential case and flipped it open. The courtroom froze. Inside, glinting under the fluorescent light, her CIA clearance badge, complete, undeniable, O'Connell's face drained of color. The prosecutor sat down. The jury's eyes went wide. The judge blinked, caught between confusion and realization. Ms. Carter, are you telling me you are currently employed by the Central Intelligence Agency? Maya shut the case with a soft snap. Yes, Your Honor. O'Connell looked sick. This is a setup. You planted that recording. She's a spook. You don't think the CIA has ways to manipulate evidence? Maya smiled slightly, and then the courtroom doors swung open. Two men in dark suits entered. Government-issued suits, the kind that commanded attention. They moved with silent efficiency, walking past the stunned spectators, and stopped, right behind O'Connell and Harris. One of the men, a stocky black agent, pulled out an official-looking document. Detective O'Connell, Officer Harris, we have a federal warrant for your arrests. Harris went rigid. Wait, what? The second agent produced handcuffs. You are being charged with conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and falsifying. Reports, we recommend you don't resist. O'Connell's mouth opened, then snapped shut. His whole body was shaking, because this wasn't just a courtroom loss. This was the end for him, for everything he thought he could get away with. He turned, his eyes burning into Maya's pure, unfiltered rage. You think this makes you safe? His voice was low, trembling. You think they will protect you? Maya didn't blink. I don't need protection from people like you. The agents pulled him to his feet. Harris was too stunned to fight. The jury stared, some in awe, some in horror. The judge took a deep breath. Court is adjourned until further notice. Maya exhaled. It was over. At least the courtroom part. As O'Connell was escorted out, he twisted his head to glare at her one last time, and then the man in the dark suit stood. The chaos didn't faze him. He simply adjusted his cuffs and walked out of the courtroom. No rush, no hesitation. Like he had already known exactly how this would end. Maya watched him go, and for the first time in this entire case, a chill ran down her spine, because if O'Connell and Harris were only pawns, then who the hell was playing the real game? Maya stood outside the courthouse, inhaling the crisp autumn air. The weight on her chest had lifted, but a new awareness settled in its place. The city felt different now, not safer, not yet, but exposed. The illusion of untouchability had been shattered, and that meant change was inevitable. O'Connell and Harris were gone, hauled away in a spectacle that had dominated the news cycle for days. The footage of their arrest had replayed across every major network, an undeniable confirmation of the corruption Maya had fought to expose. Yet she knew this was far from over. They were just two men in a much larger system, and someone with real power had been watching. The man in the dark suit. She still didn't know who he was or what his presence meant, but she would find out. She always did. The next morning, Maya sat across from Daniel in his office, the blinds drawn to block the prying eyes of reporters camped outside. "They're calling you a hero," Daniel said, tossing a newspaper onto his desk. The headline screamed, "CIA agent takes down corrupt cops, justice served." Maya smirked. "The question mark is a nice touch." Daniel exhaled. "You know how this works. Some people will celebrate you. Others will say you overstepped. And then there are the ones who are wondering what else you've been hiding." Maya's jaw tightened. "They don't like it when black women win. Not like this." "No," Daniel agreed. "They don't." Silence stretched between them before he leaned forward. "But you did win, and now we have a choice." Maya studied him. "What choice?" His gaze was steady. "How far we push this." Maya understood what he meant immediately. The case had exposed more than just O'Connell and Harris. It had cracked something deeper, an entire system that had been operating in the shadows. She had two options: let the victory stand as a warning, or dig deeper, go after the people who had enabled them. Her fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup as she considered it. She had spent years navigating a world that wanted her silent, that expected her to back down when things got hard, and every time she had fought. But this wasn't just about her anymore. O'Connell's arrest had sent shockwaves through the department. Internal Affairs had launched an investigation. Whispers of more officers under scrutiny had already begun. This was a moment, a chance to force the system to change before it buried the truth again. And Maya Carter wasn't the kind of woman to walk away from a fight. She looked Daniel in the eye. "We push." 2 weeks later, Maya walked into her old neighborhood for the first time since the case ended. She had grown up here, on these same cracked sidewalks, in the shadow of buildings. That never seemed to change, and yet today, something felt different. A group of kids played basketball in the park. They'd noticed her. Whispers spread. That's her, the one who stood up to them, the one who won. An older woman, Miss Evelyn from down the street, smiled at her from a shop window. Maya smiled back. She hadn't done this for recognition. She had done it for them, for every black kid who had ever been pulled over for no reason, for every mother who had buried a son because the system was designed to protect its own, for every person who had just ever been told to keep their head down and survive, instead of fighting to live. She had fought for them. And she wasn't done yet. O'Connell's trial was set for early next year. The evidence was airtight. With the federal charges stacking against him, he had only two options: take a plea deal and give up the names of his higher-ups, or go down alone. Maya had a feeling he wasn't built for martyrdom. She would be waiting when he finally cracked. Until then, she had work to do. That night, as she sat on her couch, a message flashed across her phone. Unknown number. "You made enemies, Carter, but you also made allies. Keep going." Maya's fingers hovered over the screen. Her heart pounded. She didn't recognize the number, didn't recognize the sender. But the message, it wasn't a threat. It was a promise, a reminder. She wasn't alone. Maya Carter smiled to herself, set the phone down, and got back to work.